Good evening. It's January 2nd, 2024. So happy New Year to you all, and I trust you had a safe and pleasant time with you and yours. So we continue with our next series from Tim Mackie. We're calling this Eat This Book. It sounded interesting to me from the beginning. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the Eat This Book source video selection set up for review. Because the purpose of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. That would be with Tim Mackie in the source video playlist. This way of doing things, you can watch the video before we begin chatting. We still hope to keep these to around 15 to 20 minutes or so, because we want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we continue our Eat This Book series with God Brings Blessing Out of Curse. And this is part 5 on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click the like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. Eat This Book. God Brings a Blessing Out of Curse, part 5. So, we're post-flood, and we're at the end of the Noah story, although it's not a nice story. And then we're going to begin our sojourn into the Tower of Babel. Remember, we're keeping things in context. So the verses, they say that 1, Noah offered up a sacrifice of clean animals. We made a box for that. 2, we started farming. And 3, after years of farming, eventually got his fruit from the vine and hopefully fermented enough to make some, hopefully, pretty good wine. And in that time, at least 1 grandchild is born. We're going to get to that reference in a bit, but it's a very limited human influence. We have only his family. And I'm sure that would come with its own pressures and its own fears. With that, we get to the famous Noah drunk story. Let's remember, like we've said many times here on the Dusty Feet, that the Bible is not a children's book. It has many adult conversations and events. We are entering into this territory, like Tim said, because this is an R-rated event. This is a very wrong event. And the author, when seeking to convey it, tries to make it as comfortable for that normal reader as they can. This whole event needs to be put in its own box. And if you choose to open it later, there's a lot of discussion between rabbis and scholars of what went on in this event. All of it is not a pretty picture. But suffice to say that Noah's son Ham, he's the major culprit in the events. His actions in this are so wrong that the storyteller has to talk around the story. You know, we've already noted that this is not a children's book, but even this one needs to be censored. The sages had some things to say about it. Again, it's your box. Open it again at will. Choose your sources carefully. You know, one of the sad points in this is that Canaan, Ham's grandson, he bears the brunt of Noah's outrage and the curse. There's going to be a box for that. But like Tim said, the virus was still here. So the flood really doesn't eradicate the virus. That again is a little bit of an uncomfortable thought. Because if it was supposed to, God probably could have just done a total reset, yeah? And he started afresh. Yet God, he chose this way. You know, it did have the possibility of slowing it down a bit. But then, after many years with the genealogies in the middle that we see, it seems to flare up again, yeah? Because right after those genealogies, we get a story of unity and dispersal. Tim brings up the point about the brick, right? That it's new tech. I'm not sure I'm as compelled by that based on some of the things with the descendants of Cain, because I think they did, but I think these guys are just getting maybe better at it. Maybe they're showing off, really. Because remember, there's a lot being passed down, not only from Noah, but from all the family members. Then Tim, as I'm listening and I'm listening to what he said, Tim says something that made me stop and think a bit. That the nations came together. And I thought about how we might view nations and how they, at the time, might have viewed nations. Because I'm more compelled that in the pre-flood and in the post-flood and this event in chapter 11, they're probably more like clans. These were groupings of families, both individual families and those that chose to live in the same area. You know, it's fun when you take the time to read things again, and we see things we might not have noticed much before. So we're in this famous story of the Tower of Babel. This is one that is the subject of so many paintings and so many pictures and so many stories. Yet, like many of the stories before, this is a rather short story, and it's sparse in detail. And we love to fill in the blanks, as it were. However, this is a massive, apocalyptic, global affecting event, and it's only 9 short verses. With a lot of stuff missing in the detail. Here it is. Now, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used bricks for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and make a tower whose top will reach into the heavens. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we're going to be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language." And this is what they began to do. So now, nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down. We're going to go down there, confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. 9 verses. Things that will create so many boxes, both theologically and historically. This is a story, like many in Scripture. Again, the pension of a lot of paintings and pictures and references to, yet most of those gloss over the depth, especially in these 9 verses. How do we start? Well, let's start with the context, the preceding stories, the genealogies. Chapter 10, because it tells us a bit about the settling of the families that grew out of the families of Noah and where they settled. You know, there are fun things in Scripture that actually happens more when we think that the stories, the information are not in the order that it's shared. Something we might read about and something in one chapter and then in a later chapter might not agree or be clear because we're not there yet in the story. One of the things might, and often does, causes challenge in Scripture, it's the very thing that helps us read it. It's these markers, these verses and chapters. Remember, these are scrolls. They're not books. These, because in those, there aren't any chapters and verses marked, right? The things that do, let's say Psalms and Proverbs are good examples of delineation, but not chapters and verses. The vast majority, they're scrolls, and therefore it's a contiguous story. So let's look at what we're looking at for fun. In chapter 10, we have these genealogies of the sons of Noah. And then we get this weird, albeit very impactful and short story, followed by a continuation of the genealogy of Shem. Because the genealogies, they start in chapter 10, about verse 21, and they jump back into the topic in chapter 11, verse 10. You know, if you were listening to the story, you're listening as it's being told, as the original audience would have been, right? Because remember, they didn't have their own Bibles. So this story, it had been a stark departure. I mean, if we were in class and it seems a lot of the hands would then go up asking, where did that come from? And then it grabbed me, because this is what hit me. At the end of chapter 10, what the teacher just said, what the storyteller just said. Let's pick it up at verse 30, okay? Now, their settlement extended from Mesha as you go towards Safar. It's the hill country in the east. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their sons, according to their genealogies, by their nations, and out of these nations were separated on the earth after the flood. See the challenge yet? We haven't heard this story of Babel yet, and yet we get languages and nations. You know, we heard these terms actually in verse 5 and verse 20, right? According to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and by their nations. So maybe the storyteller grabs the moment to say, hey, I know I just talked about families and languages and lands and nations, and this is where you all are at today, that all of you are a result of this event. So maybe I should tell you about it. Because remember that the children, the audience, right? The children of Israel, these are the people that are the descendants of the children that were called out and taken out of Egypt. And now they're in the land that they were promised by Abraham. This is a story about this is how you got here. You know, it's more of an ontological account, really, rather than a historical account. And this is how you came to be here. And in that story, there's a lot of events that get us to this place. Remember that the flood, Noah, everyone else, all of those not of the descendants of Abraham, they're still part of this as well. Abraham was a descendant of Shem, but not the only one from Shem's lineage. We are in a very adult, complicated story, which brings us back to this weird left turn by the storyteller in this genealogy, right? He's talking genealogy, and all of a sudden, we go to the Tower of Babel. Here's how we got to the nations and languages. How we once were one, and now we're separated. We know this story takes this step back, as it were. Yeah? We just really have no idea how far back it went. We have a lot missing in this, and filling in the blanks are up to our imaginations and conjecture. Yes, I said imaginations and conjecture. Because we have a people group called they. And we're going to have to imagine where the people that are in this whole earth are. Boxes, it would seem. Then this they group seems to be traveling together. And they're traveling east and they stop in the plains of Shinar. This group seems to be inclusive of the population so far. Again, it's not crystal clear, so imagination and conjecture will be needed. And if you're not comfortable with imagination and conjecture, just wait. There's more. These they people, they decide to stop, build a city, build a tower, a tall tower, it would seem, those that would reach up into the heavens. So maybe we can ask ourselves some questions about our expectations. What do we expect the story to tell us? Is it about the details of the area, the people, the tower itself? Maybe the purpose of the story is about the why and maybe the response. Because I'll go with the Shinar as part of ancient Babylon. But this appears by the preceding verses to be still a rather inclusive group. Again, I'm not compelled by the reference that Tim makes about the new technology. Again, in light of the references, the cities around Cain. The cities, they existed before this. Yes, they could have been made from rocks and wood. I'll bite. I still think imagination and conjecture will still be needed here. Suffice to say, either way, whether it's new or old, the brick is still a player in this. So Tim makes an inference that the brick is, at the least, a nefarious element, at the most, evil. Let's read it a bit, see if that fits. Because they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and in it a tower whose top will reach into the heavens. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Okay, so now I want us to remember in context, maybe to think about the original audience. Because those hearing this, they are the descendants of the children of Israel, and they're now in the land. Because they know that part of the story. They're passed on from generation to generation. So it's hard to probably not know that part of this story for them. But we are not at that point in the story yet about the whole Exodus events. They are the product of it. So maybe something to consider is how they might have viewed the bricks at this point in the story. They've been told the stories of their ancestors as it was. And they're told about the bricks. It's not a good thing. It's not a good part of the story. Nothing good can come from this. Eating this book, it's one thing, but I suspect digesting it, that other thing, might be a bit more challenging. So next week, we're going to continue on the Babel story. There's still a bit to talk about here, these 9 verses, and that shelf full of boxes. So thanks for with us tonight with Eat This Book, Part 5, on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet.